I just finished reading my first book in Korean and I totally forgot how daunting this process can be because I also learned French in school and I read countless books in French. And I remember the first book I ever had to read in French was so challenging, and because it was for school, I didn't get to pick the book and it was really above my level. But I was somewhat fortunate that my entire introduction to reading in French and reading in my first foreign language ever took place in school with the guidance of my professors, because getting started was really overwhelming, and if I was not in that environment, I might have felt like it was too daunting to even try. So I thought I would share my approach to reading the first few books in a foreign language in the hopes that if there's someone out there who is feeling a little bit overwhelmed or confused, this will help you get started and have fun. This video is basically for anyone who really wants to get started reading their first book in a foreign language, or maybe for someone who's already started but wasn't successful. Before we get started on how to read your first book, I first want to talk about two different types of reading styles that you often hear about in the language learning community, which is extensive reading and intensive reading. So if you're not familiar with these terms, extensive reading is essentially about reading for pleasure. You're just trying to read the story for enjoyment and just to get a general gist of what's going on. You're not really preoccupied with looking up every single word or expression that you don't know, nor are you trying to dissect everything in detail for full comprehension. You more so rely on context clues or like your best guess to figure out the meaning of the things that you don't know. Although once in a while you might look up a word here and there if it's really crucial to understanding the text. Then intensive reading is essentially the opposite. It's where you basically are reading to digest and understand the content entirely. So you are going to be looking up every single word and you're aiming for 100% comprehension of that text. And intensive reading is exactly how it sounds. It's intensive. The reason I wanted to first talk about the difference between extensive and intensive reading is because I personally believe when it comes to reading your first book and your first few books, it's essentially going to be a balancing act of intensive and extensive reading skills. Because a book is quite a lot of text, I feel like it is not realistic to be able to approach your first book and be like, I'm going to read this intensively from cover to cover, because that is just going to be so overwhelming and I feel like you will quit. Now, you can do that if you want to, but I feel like it's going to take you a really, really, really long time, and I doubt you will like it enough to actually finish. But starting out, I don't think that you will understand enough of your target language to be able to read your first few books entirely extensively either. It's almost like you're never really ready to read your first few books until you've already read your first few books. It's kind of like when people talk about entry-level jobs, but you need 5 years of experience. I feel like it's a very similar feeling to that. So later in this video, when I talk about how I approach reading in a foreign language, I'll talk about how I combine intensive and extensive reading to really help bridge that gap. But I think the best way to get started, and arguably the most important step, is choosing the right book for you. In my opinion, a novel, especially if this is a language that's very different from your native language, is going to be probably one of the most challenging books that you could choose. Because in a novel, there is a lot of adjectives and a lot of embellished language that people don't really use in their day-to-day lives, and you likely haven't come across a lot of that in your studies as well. What I personally recommend is starting with nonfiction books in an area that you're interested in. I'm not sure what it is, but I just feel like nonfiction books tend to be easier to understand than fiction books. And some books will just be much easier than others, so I always highly recommend, if you can, check a preview of the book so that you can just verify that it's not going to be too difficult. Another thing that I recommend is looking for books that are divided into a lot of small chapters, or books that have within those chapters a lot of subsections. That way you can gradually work on the book one small section at a time. Now that you have a book to read, let's talk about how to get started reading in another language. So like I said, with my first few books, I tend to do a combination of intensive and extensive reading. So I start out by reading just a small section of the book and I just try to understand what I can. Then I go back and I reread that section, and with a pencil or an erasable pen, I just underline everything that I come across that I don't know. Then the next step I might do in the same sitting, but honestly, most of the time I will often do it a different day because it can be very fatiguing to do all of this in one sitting. I go and I look up the meaning of all of the words I underlined page by page, and then I write the definition at the bottom of the page it's on. Now, when I'm doing this, I try to minimize how many words I'm actually defining in my book, because this is essentially a form of intensive reading. And if you're intensively reading your first book to 100%, it's going to be way too much and way too overwhelming. Sometimes I underline words, and then later when I'm going back to look up the definitions, I realize, hey, I kind of already knew what this word meant. And when I checked the definition, I was basically right. So I don't really need to write this definition in my book. And then sometimes I come across words that I'm like, okay, for this one little sentence, I really needed to know what this word meant to understand what's going on. But this is the kind of word that I could go forever and never learn, and it's probably not going to harm me in any way. So I'm just also going to leave this off as well, because I don't want to focus my energy on words like semiconductor, for example, because it's not my priority. Since looking up words takes time, I usually just end that session and I come back another day and I reread the section referencing the definitions I wrote in my book at the bottom of the page as I go. I don't really care if I've memorized these words or their meanings. I just want to give myself a chance to reread and deepen my understanding of the text. Also, I like that having written all of the meaning of the words directly in my book, it's very convenient when I'm going back and rereading, because I can just look at the bottom of the page and instantly see the meaning of the word I'm looking for. Versus if I were to write the meaning of all of these words on a separate notebook, it would have been really impractical and very annoying to have to constantly reference this notebook every time I wanted to reread the book. And after I reread that section, I essentially move on to the next one and I repeat the process. But something else that I do, which I think really makes a world of difference, is for every 3 to 5 sections that I read, I will go back and reread those 3 to 5 sections all together in one sitting. It doesn't have to be 3 to 5 sections, but just in general, I find that after you move forward in the book for a while, the more you go back and review and reread some of the sections you previously learned, it really helps solidify that new vocabulary in your head. Basically, my approach is on a section by section basis. I first read extensively, and then I read intensively, but not like 100% intensively. And then I reread, and then a little bit later, I come back and review. Then if you try this method and you get through your first book, you might wonder what to do next. And honestly, I just say, just do it again with another book in a similar genre with a similar difficulty level. I say that because if you choose a book that's about a similar topic to the first book you read, there's a higher likelihood that some of the words you came across in that first book are going to show up again in this book. And with that constant exposure, it's really going to help you learn some of these words, get more exposure to them, and it will help you understand the second book much more than you understood the first one, because now you have a little bit more of the vocabulary necessary to understand it. Basically, just keep going, because after a few books, your vocabulary and your tolerance for reading in this language is going to improve to the point that eventually you will feel the difficulty declining. Then, in my opinion, you will hit a point where you will be able to branch out more and more to other topics, and eventually you'll get to a point where you can actually read an entire book extensively. And when you reach this place where you feel you can read comfortably, you can use intensive reading to boost your vocabulary without so much mental effort.